One of the reasons that really altered my research is when I stopped thinking about conspiracy theory as sort of a pathological problem. It's simply just telling lies, and I started to realize that conspiracy theory is a window into someone's account of evil in the world. It's a manifestation of their desire, malformed as it might be, for justice.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. We're living in a strange moment, a moment where two people can look at the same event and walk away with completely different versions of reality, where facts multiply faster than we can process them, where stories compete for our attention, and where conspiracy theories often feel more compelling than the truth. Part of the challenge is simply the scale of information we live inside. A century ago, humanity's collective knowledge doubled roughly every 25 years. Today, some estimates say it doubles every day or two. We aren't starving for facts anymore. We're drowning in them. And when the world feels overwhelming like that, we reach for stories to make sense of it. Sometimes those stories help us see clearly. Other times, they pull us deeper into fear, suspicion, and ideological certainty. In the church, especially in American evangelicalism, that dynamic can become even more complicated. Faith, politics, identity, and national stories all get tangled together. And sometimes what begins as an attempt to defend the faith ends up distorting the very story we claim to believe. My guest today is theologian Jared Stacy, and he has a name for the moment we're living in. He calls it dis-reality. So in this conversation, we talk about why conspiracy thinking spreads the way it does, why it has found such fertile ground in American Christianity, and what it might look like for the church to recover something deeper than ideological certainty. Because the real question isn't just how to correct bad information, it's how we learn to live faithfully and tell better stories in a world where reality itself feels contested. So join us. Here is my conversation with Jared Stacy. Jared, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Joshua. This is good. I've been looking forward to it.
I have too. You name the moment that we're living in. You believe that the moment we're living in is one of dis-reality.
Yeah.
What does that mean, dis-reality? What is that for you?
What I mean is to really name a state of existence, right? So it may sound like an academic term, but I'm really trying to give us language for the everyday that we're living in. But by dis-reality, it's very common to hear when you encounter conspiracy theories, and particularly friends or family and communities where these narratives are really prominent, to sort of say, oh, they're not living in reality. But upon closer examination, I'm really trying to use this language to describe the experience of so many different realities sort of colliding in our everyday. And so, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist, badge carrying, to recognize that we are living in this split world of different realities that are just vying for attention, vying for our interpretation of particular events. And so it's a big concept, but I want to keep it simple and just say it's what it feels like to live in our moment with all these different realities clashing.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are different realities clashing, that things are coming from different sides, that we don't know what is really real?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is just we're human beings. And so we're limited, and we live in a time where technology gives us the illusion that we can transcend those limits. And so I think in some ways, dis-reality is a technologically induced state of existence, right? So it's the speed and the scale of our information processing. And to illustrate this, can I illustrate it real quick?
Yeah, please.
Robert Buckminster, and I talk about this in the book, introduced this concept called the information doubling curve. And some of your listeners may have heard of this, where he looked at, around the turn of the 20th century, 1900, he looked at how often humanity's sum total of knowledge was doubling. And when right after World War I, he estimated that humanity's sum total of information was probably doubling every 25 years. Well, now current estimates have our information doubling almost every 12 to 24 hours. So when you think about just the vast sum of facts or data, we're swimming in it. And so the problem in this reality is not just we don't have enough facts, but it's also that we might have too many. And that's a defaulting, like how do we cope with this?
And so one of the ways that we have coped with it is to start to tell conspiracy theories, and to theorize. And I think because it is narrative driven, it's story driven more than it is, data and facts and what is there. Do you think because we have so much data, facts, knowledge, information, that we tend to move towards give us a story to make sense of this brand new stuff that we're inundated with constantly?
Yeah, I think that's part of who we are just as human beings. I mean, this is something humanity has always done is we've always told stories. And it's why, particularly because I wrote the book with evangelical Christians and that particular community in mind. And it's where I came from. This is my people. I was raised in these spaces. And we tend to look at Genesis, for example, as sort of a set of facts, but really in an ancient sense, what Genesis was doing, it was telling a counter story to the dominating origin stories of cultures around Israel. And so I think this is something where this isn't necessarily a new problem that we're kind of reaching for narrative to make sense of all these disparate bits of data and sound bite. It's how we process information. That's a very difficult thing to do, which is why people tend to, instead of reaching for story and narrative, which takes time, it requires a community. Ideology is a much more at hand, in the air sort of option to survive. And so that's why you can't really separate conspiracy as a storytelling act with the ideology that sort of gives it its content.
Separate that out for me.
Sure, yeah.
What then is like narrative story that makes sense of the world that we could live in faithfully and be good people, and then ideology that really then shapes us into, I think we'll do anything for it because we think this is the sum of the world, this is what makes sense of the world, and so
Yeah.
we enact violence and different things because of it.
Yeah, I can separate those. And I think the key point of separation, if we're thinking about this as Christians, is that ideology is static, right? It doesn't really change. It's set principles, it's a form of certainty. But and I understand deeply like the notion that the Christian story should also appear static, but that's not what we see in the scripture. It's not that God isn't trustworthy. It's that he is. But when he tells Moses his name, I will be what I will be. That's dynamic. That invites a sense of ongoing participation. And so it's not that the Christian story doesn't offer us this sort of certainty. It's that it offers us the need for faith to trust who God has been in the past, he will continue to be in the present and the future. But ideology sort of flattens that all out into a set of principles, into schemes. And I happen to think that the Christian story, when we participate in it and we understand the ongoing story that we're made part of in our baptism, that actually subverts the schemes of ideology. It sort of makes us uncertain again. It unsettles us. One of my favorite metaphors that I picked up in writing the book was from a Dutch pastor who talks about sabotage, right? And so I love this idea of story, but the Christian story injects a severe amount of uncertainty that conspiracy theories always try and put back in the box, always trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube.
If you're running a business, you know the weight. You're the visionary, the problem solver, the one who keeps it all moving. But the truth is, you can't grow when you're buried in the doing. What if you could multiply your results by finally handing off the work that's holding you back? That's what Sidekick makes possible. They match business owners with world-class virtual assistants, real humans, not AI, skilled professionals who bring focus, follow-through, and freedom to your business for 60 to 70% less than hiring locally. So stop carrying it all alone. Head to getyoursidekick.com/shiftingculture and book a call to see how Sidekick can help you scale your business, reclaim your time, and finally breathe again. So why do you think that evangelicalism's part of the feature of evangelicalism is conspiracies and conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so what I try to do in the book is I try to show historical episodes of ways that conspiracy theory has surfaced. And every single time when conspiracy theory sort of surfaces inside evangelicalism, well, for one, it's not an evangelical problem only. It's borrowed content from the social and political order that the United States of America is trying to put in place. And so that sort of eruption of, hey, how do we keep this sort of order intact? Always it finds its way into the theology that evangelicals are using. So, for example, whether it was preaching a gospel right before the American Revolution in figures like George Whitefield, who would say, "Hey, white slave owners, I'm going to preach to your slaves, your enslaved people," which was a big no-no. We don't want to preach the gospel to enslaved people, but Whitefield did. But the way that he did it was a gospel that was moralized to, if you're enslaved and you come to Jesus, then you should also obey your master. So again, the theology was sort of wedded to this conspiratorial fear in a way that said, we can come to Jesus without changing our social order. And so these historical episodes follow that all the way through. And I think at the heart of it, when you start to look at the pattern that unites all of these episodes, you really start to see that the Christian story has sort of been turned into a sort of theological ideology that serves a unquestionable story of America. And when that story kind of wags the tail of the dog, the tail wagging the dog, when that happens, the Christian story is robbed of its subversive potential. And then what happens is, our love for America becomes unquestionable. It's not on the table. It's like playing poker with a couple cards, under the table. And that's why conspiracy theory has erupted across America, but then finds its very unique sort of theological charge inside evangelicalism. So I'll wrap all that by saying I don't think evangelicals are particularly prone to conspiracy theory more than any other modern sociological category. But what I do think is that when conspiracy theory finds its way into evangelicalism, there's a lot of theological content that supercharges it in a very dangerous way. And that's what I'm trying to kind of exhume in the book and find a way towards something better.
Have you looked outside of American evangelicalism throughout evangelicalism around the world?
Yeah.
And are these types of stories taking hold around the world, or is it just a particular feature of American evangelicalism?
You could make the argument that America has a particular relationship with conspiracy theory. But when you look at the world at large, conspiracy theory is not something that is necessarily unique to Americans. It's something that could be psychologically normal. I remember when I was writing the book, though, and doing some of my doctoral research, I heard from a pastor. It was during COVID, and I heard from a pastor in Australia. And what he mentioned to me was that all the conspiracy theories or the narrative suggestions of where this pandemic came from, in America, the story was told that, well, this was hatched and intentionally spread by China. Well, in Australia, among Chinese nationals that were at this pastor's church, it was inverted. America was the one that did this. So I think that illustrates, there's a sort of universality to this, that we're always looking for explanations beyond what we can reasonably know. And so what some of the research also suggests, just to show that this happens outside of our context, is that the act of actual conspiracy theorizing usually tends to come from people who feel oppressed or persecuted. Whether or not that's legitimate is not the point of the study. The point was that those feelings of persecution, that perception of oppression, is what generates a sort of need to narrate things conspiratorially, because there must be some more reason why this is happening to us.
So how does fear then play out in all of that? And how does that distort really maybe our theology and our view of God?
Yeah, so I think this goes in two directions. I mean, for one, the fear has to do with how we think the world works. And this, you don't have to be a Christian to find your way into this path that I'm paving, because modern people, we tend to think in terms of individualism, and particularly, if I go and I do something, it's a direct cause and effect. And so most of us want to live in a world where if we see something happen, there's a very clear cut explanation. Person A did action B that resulted in, event C. And that sort of direct line, that's not how the world works. One of the reasons that conspiracy theory fails is it's actually too simplistic. That when we kind of boil it down to its some parts, we really think that Bill Gates has enough control to generate and engineer something so vast as a pandemic that's there. Now there's exceptions. There's exceptions. I look at the German Wannsee conference. So those who maybe have watched Star Wars show Andor, there's a fictional representation of how the Nazis planned the Holocaust in a business meeting. And so there are these concentrations of power, but it's also chaotic. The only reason we know about that meeting is because a secretary who attended it did not burn the transcript like he was told. And so there's always this grain or kernel of truth that kind of resists the oversimplification that conspiracy theory offers. And when we start to pave, the second part of your question is, how do we deal with that theologically? This fear. I think when we start to pave that theological path, we always come to this conclusion that it is the idols that we create or that we associate with God are the ones who are more domesticated. They're the gods that we control. So, for that question, I would take us straight to Mount Sinai after Israel is liberated from Egypt, and we forget. I mean, I forget. I heard that story a lot growing up, but a detail escaped it until I recognized. They named the golden calf Yahweh, right? They didn't create just a false god. They created a false representation of the God who brought them out of Egypt. And that's exactly what they did. They started to tell the story. This is the God who brought us out of the land of Egypt, right? And why did they do that? Well, they did that because they were afraid. They're like, hey, Moses went up that mountain and it's thundering, and I don't think anybody's surviving that. So we need to do something. And so there's always this fear that we need to get ahead of God. And that getting aheadness it's the sin of Eden. It's seizing the knowledge of good and evil for ourselves. And so it's sort of conspiracy just evacuates the need for faith. It evacuates the need for waiting on the Lord, calling upon the Lord. And in its place, we get this corrosive form of certainty that can only come from the delusion that we're in control.
It feels good though, doesn't it?
It really does. It really
Yeah.
does. I mean, and research backs that up. Psychology backs that up. That our need for, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? This need for balance, for certainty, for control. I mean, we're Christian or not, we're talking about a deeply created and survival instincts that humanity has used to, live the next day.
We all at the core, we want peace. Like we yearn for what true peace really is. We yearn for what the kingdom of God is all about.
Right.
And we're yearning for this place. And we're trying to actually then control it and get certainty so that we can manufacture this place. And so now it's happening everywhere that we're all manufacturing these, and we're manufacturing these stories to so we could grab a hold of something and the certainty. Have you seen anything that helps us start to take that away and to actually live in reality, not in the disreality that we have found ourselves in? Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com, and with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to answer that question at two levels. And the first is sort of accessible for non-Christians too, is to say, like media literacy has never been at a greater premium and a greater need than it has been right now. And thankfully, there's a lot of people really doing incredible work on this. But, you and I both know, and your listeners know, that every video that comes through our feeds, especially things coming out of Minneapolis, like we focus on the analysis, and most of us are not equipped with the skill set or the software to be able to identify whether or not something is quote unquote materially real anymore. And the ways in which artificial intelligence we're really approaching and have probably already jumped off this cliff where nothing that we see mediated through our screens is real. Every bit of digital information is disinformation. And so one of the things that I just keep harping on, and in a positive sense, is we can never have too much media literacy. And there's always going to be new strategies. But in the book, I do try to offer some questions that I think perform interventions. One of them being, why do I want this to be true? That even asking that question before we hit share on a video or something, like it acknowledges our biases, it acknowledges our suspicion. And so I just want to, Christian or non-Christian, we all need and could benefit from more media literacy. But when it comes to then being Christian, how do we begin to confront this and to do so maybe in a way that isn't captured by like the partisan finger pointing of like, hey, like the right is full of conspiracy theories. One of the things I found in my research is that there's no ideological headquarters for conspiracy theorizing. It doesn't do that. But that's not me playing both sides. It's me acknowledging that like the partisan break on that. Now, each of the partisan sides have a particular ideology, a totality. We need to enter and speak on its own terms to undo this. But when it comes to evangelicals in America, like again, a community that I'm familiar with, I came out of, I'm all of that to say, I think that one of the burdens that I have in contending with this is that not to put the fact checker hat on every pastor. Like pastors in America are already asked to be, CEOs. They're already, many of them have the pressure to run a podcast, to be an influencer, to do all these things. Why don't we just not give another task like, hey, why don't you fact check everything? And so I'm not diminishing media literacy, but what I'm really interested in doing from a Christian perspective as a theologian, because that's my training and skill set, is to figure out ways that just the faithful act of Christian preaching can actually subvert and question, sabotage some of the ways that conspiracy theory through propaganda kind of sinks its teeth into us and gets a hold on us. And I do think that Christian preaching can do that. And one of the ways that I think it can, first and foremost, is really by focusing on Christ. And I don't mean for that to sound glib. I mean for it to sound like, hey, this is the center, and everything else comes out from around this. And maybe the preaching that takes seriously the question, is this an American Jesus that people are coming around? I've had people who've told me and have pushed back saying, hey, you are attacking Christians and their love for America. And well, my kind of gesture towards that is to say, actually, I think that's what this gospel does. This gospel doesn't really leave us to our own loves, and it's always going to interrogate that. And I think that Christian preaching can do that, and yes, do it in a political way, but not in a partisan way. In the sense that, yeah, politics is about the material, and Christians should be concerned about the material lives of other people around us. And what draws our attention to those lives and those realities? It's the stories we tell. And I think that Christian preaching can and does, when it's filled with the Spirit, can subvert the sort of stories and rogue words that try to rival the word of Christ, right? So I'm trying to do this distinctively Christian, but then also gesture towards, hey, we need more media literacy. That's a good thing.
Take me back into something like Columbine and the Columbine shooting as an example for us to say, hey, this can move into maybe some conspiracy thinking or trying to, tell stories that really make sense of the tragedy through like martyrdom myths and things.
Yeah, I grew up in evangelical youth groups during the Columbine era, right? And so, for listeners who are familiar with Columbine, let me just, re-explain a little bit about what happened to listeners who may not understand. Is that Columbine was a major school shooting that happened in Colorado in the late 90s. And one of the ways that that story kind of gained a lot of traction in evangelical youth groups was there was this student by the name of Cassie Bernal. And in what happened was, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, a student had reported that she was asked in the library, hey, are you a Christian? And supposedly she said yes, and then she was shot, and she was murdered, and it was a tragedy. And what happened is that story, that myth, because the reality was that student came out the very week later and said, oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't her, it was someone else who was asked that question, and that student survived. And so, but what we had a very powerful martyrdom myth. And I'm a hospice chaplain in my day job, right? So I say in the book, like, these are grieving parents. Like, Cassie Bernal's parents were grieving. They were reaching for ways to explain and find meaning in their daughter's murder. And so there's a human element there. But what happened outside in the evangelical kind of industry was that they seized on this story and wrote a book. Michael W. Smith wrote a song about it. And I sat in youth groups thousands of miles removed from the Columbine community, basically understanding, I need to be serious enough about my faith that I would say yes if someone pointed a gun at me. And that the power of that myth, the power of that martyrdom far outpaced, the reality, the fog of war, the complexity, and the grief, the human grief that was at that site at Columbine. And so when you look at that, when you look at the ways, this story wasn't created at Columbine, though. There was already, through the Left Behind books, through a host of other evangelical initiatives, there was already this sense, this story that God, that Christians were a persecuted minority in America. And so that story sort of enclosed this event and generated an interpretation that, while it may not have been true to the facts on the ground, was perceived as generally true. And so then you have this narration where it's comfortable saying, why do we let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? And that's where we are. And so to contrast that with this idea of Christian and Jesus, one of the things that, just to really drive this point home, is I think Jesus also delivers us from our Christianity too. The idea of being Christian in America, it's not this clear-cut answered question. That there's a lot of contested answers to what does it mean to be faithful in America as a Christian. And so I think by rooting this back in an understanding of Jesus, that doesn't mean that we're the right ones. It means that we are willing to be called out and called wrong. It means that we're willing to work through this in a community and discern what is the way of Jesus in our time. And there's something about, famously, and Mark Knoll is a historian who came out of evangelical circles. And I don't mention this in the book, but he writes a book about basically evangelical intellectualism. He called it, the scandal of the evangelical mind. And the opening line is just so searing. He goes, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there isn't one. Right. And that's just like a brazen, scorched earth, approach. Maybe not helpful for sitting down with someone, in your community, saying, well, here, you got the evangelical mind. You don't think at all. Like, that's not helpful in personal conversations. But when we think about, sites like Columbine, and we start to move that into the present, where talk about martyrdom is so loaded with partisan like just content. My way, my work and my way is really just trying to help us arrive at the point where we're thinking as Christians, and we're determined not by the status of a particular sociological group in America, but we're more determined by being in a community where what it means to be Christian is a live question that's generating fresh answers. And so to that extent, I really have come to the conclusion that evangelical as a label may be doing us some harm, in that it simply serves as a shelter away from these very live questions. It's if identifying as an evangelical means that we don't have to answer to any sort of accountability, then it's not a theological term. It's not a sign of fidelity to any sort of orthodoxy. It's an escape hatch. It's and I that's my concern, is when we turn a label or these stories into something static and fixed, we lose that dynamic element that comes with being, saying like, hey, I was wrong, or hey, I need to think through this, or I need to encounter someone else and gain a different perspective.
Have you gained any different perspective as a hospice chaplain of knowing what people hold on to at the end, what they let go of, and what's really important for us? And maybe we could learn something before we get
Yeah.
to the end.
I mean, that's a great question. And, one of the things that I see very clearly is that one of the things I've changed my mind about and find myself holding looser and looser is the association with like a particular movement, right? Like the movements that we might align with, or the things that we might kind of use to identify ourselves. When you're on your deathbed, you're not necessarily reaching for, a red hat or a hashtag. You are reaching for your family, you're reaching for your community. And that's not to diminish political involvement as much as it is to start to ask, what does our politics mean among people who live and die? What does it mean to be political if this is what the end of human life entails? What's most important at the end of life? Alleviating pain, alleviating discomfort, finding closure and reconciliation with relationships. That's politics. But when we identify with movements, when we identify with these ideologically charged identities, a lot of times what happens is we actually lose sight of our ability to answer real material political questions. I think the other thing too, because every time I walk into someone's room, I'm recognizing that I'm on the receiving end of whatever God has been to them, whatever experience they've had. And I think I've hopefully loosened my grip on the illusion that with enough rational, logical erudition, I can convince people. What people need increasingly at the end of life is not answers, but presence. And I think that that's distinctly Jesus, right? That Jesus's life and teaching was not absent from, preaching, repent, the kingdom of God is at hand. I mean, that was his message, but that was prone to misunderstanding, wasn't it? Jesus, are you not going to restore the kingdom now? Hey, Jesus, you want to take our, you want us to go? Peter's drawing this. So the disciples are always, for our benefit, always showing us how Jesus's teaching in our hands becomes totally opposed to the presence, towards the figure of his life. And this is where I think, to going back to your distinction between Christian and Jesus, where we've lost sight of what it means to be cruciform, to be a cruciform presence in the world, versus people who have such certainty in our stories, and to you know encapsulate that all in one moment in the gospel texts. I really think Jesus's first temptation, right, where the Satan comes and says, hey, if you'll but turn these stones to bread, why won't you do that if you're the son of God? Well, Satan was seeding the theological truth that if you are the son of God was not in question. It was because you are the son of God, turn these stones into bread. And he was inviting Jesus to prove the validity, the credibility of his message by being something other than what he was and who he was, which was a son dependent on his father, and Israel dependent on the provision of Yahweh. And so in so many ways, we're the stories that we tell, these conspiracies are turning the stones into bread. It's our attempt at sufficiency and efficiency that denies the sort of cruciform dependence. And so this is what happens when Christianity turned into a sort of logical rationality that can be proved by argument and debate. We miss out on the presence of the Spirit that Scripture tells us is what gives credibility to the gospel message. It's not that we shouldn't have conversations about the rational veracity of Christian faith. We could do that, but I'm more interested, because of what I do day to day, but also as a theologian, that the presence of Jesus in the world is far more, and is what gives his preaching not just its credibility but also its content. And to the extent that conspiracy theories are sort of trying to defend Jesus, it's a form of the sword that Peter takes out, like, hey, let's make sure that Jesus is defended in Western civilization. That's not what the presence of Jesus brings and does and is in the world. And that's preaching. That's preaching. Practicing what I'm saying on here.
So do you think that the proximity, the presence that we can have with people, can that actually give people what they need when, in response to the pain, the panic that they're feeling, the power that they're seeking, or the lack of power they're feeling, since they're going for the story of conspiracy? How do you think proximity and presence actually then shows a different way, in a way that says this is what reality is?
Yeah, I think for those of us who are in these sort of conversations, or who for many probably good difficult reasons have removed ourselves from these sorts of conversations, because we don't know what else to say other than, you're no longer the person I remember, and this is really difficult for me. So I want to hold space for all of these different reactions, but to bring about this sense of proximity that I do think allows and affords people the safety to change their minds. It's something that I needed as a young white Christian serving as a 20 something pastor in New Orleans, right? Where for the first time I realized that my America was not the America experienced by those I observed communion with on Sunday, who were African American and who had lived in that city longer than I had been alive. And so what I wasn't on the receiving end of was any sort of top down, like, here's the education, here's the work you need to do. I was subverted through loving, attentive, pebble in my shoe kind of questions that were offered in the safety of proximity and presence. And I'm not saying that works universally for everybody. What I am saying is that in my own particular experience, that was an unraveling that I couldn't fix even if I wanted to. And so I think what we're getting at here is that the idea and the reality of our presence in people's lives can be more disruptive than the best logically tight argument. And in the book, I do make the point that arguing facts and figures doesn't displace the more powerful story. And so I think our presence in someone's life does have its own sort of apologetic. It does have, and what I mean by that is being people who are trusting in the Lord to say, I cannot convince this person otherwise, but I'm not going to be anything but a safe presence for them when they feel their world coming apart. Because at some point, that's where, the more you give yourself to falsehood, the more the illogical nature of it all is going to unravel. We want to be the people who are there when that does happen, because there's been people who have done that for us. As we talk about presence as this, way to persist in people's lives among our own selves, I look ahead to the next 5 or 10 years in the hope that there will be safe places for people to do the hard work of truth and reconciliation, right? It's not, it's being less on the truth, but it is acknowledging. And I'm really thinking of Jesus's restoration of Peter, and when you read that John's account of it in the Gospel of John, for listeners who may not know, Jesus or Peter denied Jesus by standing over an open charcoal fire. And one of Jesus's post-resurrection appearances in the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus awoke and made breakfast over a charcoal fire, right? Like John used the same word. And he was a presence that literally allowed Peter to rehearse in a positive sense his failure. And so that restorative presence, that ability to rehearse a past failure, I think we see Jesus is very capable of changing people's minds. And the point of bringing that point up is I'm not I'm interested in a civic sense in common truth, common good. But as a Christian theologian, I'm most interested in the sort of presence that Jesus has in the world, and that reconciliation that has already been accomplished flowing out from that center point, from the church. And so for the church to be a presence in the world where these sorts of charcoal fire encounters are made, I think that's really what we're called to be. And so the difference between that is the difference between being an analyst or being a witness, right? The analyst brings data together. A witness kind of points to people to say, this is the true story of the world, and this is a presence that's working in our midst as we discern together. Come and be part of that. That's its own sort of logic. That's its own sort of argument, and it doesn't always fit neatly into the fact checking activisms that are so prominent and prevalent, and maybe for good reason, but can also be hijacked and used as overt forms of censorship. So there we are.
So you're saying all we need to do is have a barbecue with people and everything will work out, right? That's all this.
Well, that's a good devil's advocate question, because like that's precisely why this proximity is so difficult. That it can't just be barbecues. It has to be the hard work of extending grace where grace is undeserved. And so I'm very keen on not boiling this all down to a very nice, neat middle class mentality that right just says, hey, like let me just invite my politically antagonistic friends over, and we'll grill some food and watch the Super Bowl and see what comes of that. No, I'm looking at this particularly in the context of our churches, where political difference is acknowledged. In some ways it's given its space, but there's enough theological teeth to be able to identify like this is the way of Babylon, and this is not a way that we can walk, and drawing those lines. And so there does need to be a line drawing. The presence in people's life, I think of the rich young ruler maybe as a really good example of this sort of presence, right? Where, what does the text say? That the rich young ruler came in, like checked off all these commands. And so what Jesus is doing is kind of setting him up to say, okay, if you're living within the confines that these commands set out, like if you're really living inside the space, you've followed all of them. All right. So now you're in the arena. Are you ready? Why do you call me good? There's no one good except for God alone. Jesus is not denying his divinity. He's establishing it for this encounter. Like, are you ready? Because I'm about to give you a direct command, which is to go sell everything you have. And so I think when we focus on the difference between wanting to save Christianity or wanting to counter Jesus, only one of those has to be ready to hear the command of God, the living command of God. And so that's why it has to be more than middle class barbecues. It has to be more than simply the sociality that the community that we might experience at a barber shop. It has to be something that is unique to the form of life that the church, I think, spiritually is given to the world. And that sort of life is a life of hearing God's command and making a decision. It so in so many ways, like this presence is a presence of crisis. And that's why for so many of us we exist and persist as people who, but Jesus's words finally start to make sense, like a prophet's not without honor except in his hometown. Shake the dust off your feet. Who are my mother and sister and brothers? those who do the will of God are as my mother and sister and brother. So suddenly this sort of crisis, and Jesus doesn't fit neatly into the kumbaya that, to be honest with you, I see a lot of in the progressive side, in this kind of, it's an elitist sort of mindset of, hey, if we could just all like be like us, then things would be okay. And there's a there's a whole bunch of material, economic, class things bound up in that we don't have to get into. But my point in bringing all this up is that the church is a different form of life that it exists to preserve and announce this crisis of decision. So, Joshua, I appreciate you drawing that line, because it is really important. I don't want to leave people with the notion that if you've cut people off, or if you have difficulty, that it may not just need to be a barbecue. It may need to be a conversation with your pastor. Like, hey, what can I do? How can I be? I'm that is, I think, where the Spirit is particularly awake to encouraging those whose presence continues to bring up the crisis in people's lives, who want to be just affirmed in their malformed sense of certainty that comes from conspiracy.
I was talking to somebody the other day about the difference between timeless stories and time-bound stories. It seems like conspiracy theories are stories are time-bound. They're about here and now, and this is the pain point, and this is how it explains the pain point. As believers, as followers of Christ, we're called to tell stories. I mean, Jesus was a storyteller. The Bible is written narratively in a lot of ways. We're just storied creatures. How do we tell better stories in a way that point to Christ, in a way to live in this world that actually says what is the really real? What's the real underneath all this disreality that we're living in? But not get caught up in these time-bound conspiratorial stories that we say, I just need to shout my story louder than your story, and my story is going to win. What
Mm-hmm.
does it look like to tell better stories that make a difference in a shouting attention economy that we have?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and I'm going to keep coming back to, I think, the role that the church can play in this civic moment. And it's not that the church's chief task is to promote or reify democracy, right? That's not the church's task. The church has existed in so many different political orders over time, so I don't want to just lead with making the assumption that if the church does its job, then a healed democracy is the outcome. Do I think that democratic practice like is necessary in this moment? Yeah, I do. But I also don't want to commit the church to any sort of necessity that arises from other grounds except for Christ and him crucified, right? And so I think when we're looking at the ways in which this this need to be storytellers, I'm reminded that we first have to hear the story. That the resonance, that we, all of us, walk into the preaching moment, the church gathering every week, with so many different stories ringing in our ears. And 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 so the need for not just the preaching moment, but for the liturgy, the entirety of the church's gathering, to be a reminder, a rehearsal of what this word is, of who we are. And that sort of is me saying very, very verbosely that worship is this central point where we remember the story. I mean, Stanley Hauerwas has this great line that memory is a moral exercise. And one of the reasons that really altered my research is when I stopped thinking about conspiracy theory as sort of a pathological problem, as simply just telling lies. And I started to realize that, like, conspiracy theory is a window into someone's account of evil in the world. It's a manifestation of their desire, malformed as it might be, for justice. So where are these malformations occurring? And I think that especially in white evangelicalism, a lot of these are tied back up in this collapsing of the Christian story into this particular story of America. Well, to boil this down to like what we're talking about with worship in the church, every church in America is is telling a story about America, whether it realizes it or not, whether through silence or overt statements or slogans. Every church nurses an account of what the United States is and where it factors into God's work in the kingdom and the world. And I know that even by bringing this up, that many pastors, especially evangelical pastors in America, would be putting their jobs at risk. And I think we just really have to like name that what we're discussing here about worship as being this subversive way of putting the story that we're putting about America back on the table. That'll ruin churches. I mean, it will. I've seen it. And so I don't want to be, the sort of ivory tower academic descending down and saying, well, this is what we need to do to fix. I'm actually here saying, if this is the path, like it's going to ruin more than it fixes at first. And I keep coming back to the story of Gideon as worship as being this place where we become better storytellers. Before Gideon was sent to recruit his army to liberate the Midianites, he was asked to do one thing, and that was to tear down the Asherah pole in his hometown. His dad would put up on the hillside, and I always read that story as, idol. Okay, that's something primitive. Like, I'm not worshiping a pole, but you know what? That pole for them was their crop cycle, was the promise that they would continue to have children and sustain their community. It was for them all the isms, all the institutions that we take for granted and assume is given today. And Gideon toppled it. He was so scared to do it, right? He did it at night. And what did he experience? His dad wakes up in the morning, sees it's down, and basically said, "Hey, that's not, that's my boy, and you do with him as you see fit. Like, he's not, hey, I didn't do this." And so worship in that sense is a toppling of these things and learning to be better storytellers. Then I'm not saying it's just a technique alone. Yeah, like we need to focus on how the Christian message can be contained and spread through the amazing set of technological opportunities that we have. But at its core, I think the determinative context for us becoming better storytellers is us hearing the story, is us saying, in a time where so much pressure is on us to answer the question, what do we have to do? I think the actual Christian question is, what do we need to hear? Because if we boil down, or if we centralize what the scripture is doing, it is witnessing to Christ. And before we can go out and witness, not in a sense of a technique, but really live lives that embody the presence of Jesus in the world, we must be people who have been immersed in this story and who can learn, discern in a community to begin to narrate our lives, not the way that middle class values would narrate it, not in the way that any one particular cultural group might narrate it. And it's not evacuating difference. It's returning to our point of determination that then makes us fit on the way to begin to point out and generate attention to different things that we wouldn't have otherwise recognized. And that's really painful. No one's hearing all this and thinking, that's what I want more of. That's why I come to church. No one wants that. And yet God graciously sabotages our schemes and messes with us. And so yeah, I think that's part of the way. I think that's part of the way is recapturing.
Jared, this has been fascinating, fantastic. I wish I had another 3 hours to talk to you. There's some other threads that I really want to go into, but we don't have time. But I do have a couple quick questions at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh man, if you get 21, if I could go back and talk to myself at 21, I would say this: do not take yourself so seriously. I'll say, don't take yourself so seriously.
We all need to hear that
Yeah,
at some point in our lives. So that's great. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I am reading right now, so I'm working my way through Christian ethicist Brian Brock. He's written a book called Joining Creation's Praise. and it is a tome. I mean, it's like 900 pages. So when I say I'm working through it, I'm looking at the subject index and saying, oh, I wonder what Brian has to say about technology, and I'll read a couple pages, right? So I'm working through that. That's been really good. Watching. What am I watching? I mean, I finished Stranger Things, so I'll say like that. I have lots of other takes about that show that I'm really interested in, but I think in some ways there's been this shift away from irony and away from cynicism and not taking things, kind of not trying to see things and just kind of embrace it for what it is. And I think that show sort of embodies that sort of shift that we're seeing in our culture of like, hey, we're just not going to sit back and throw stuff at a wall and laugh at the whole thing. We're actually going to care. And I think that show, because it trades in so much nostalgia, is kind of an embodiment of this shift that we're seeing. That's the take.
That's great. Well, Reality and Ruins will be available anywhere books are sold. People could go and get that. It's a fantastic read. If you've loved our conversation, you need to read the book because the book is fantastic. How can people connect with you and what you're doing? Is there anywhere you'd like to point people to?
Sure, yeah. So I'm most probably active on Instagram and Threads. And so you can find me there, Jared M. Stacy. But then you can also on my website, jaredstacy.com. I would love to speak with more Christians and churches and also civic organizations too. But I know primarily our listeners are in church every week, and have these kind of conversations at a local church level. I mean, I was a pastor for 10 years before I went into the academy and got theological training in that way. And so, yeah, I just kind of put that out there as, I'm willing to discuss this and work through this at a local church level. And so if that's interesting to anyone, or wants to bring me out for that sort of thing, I'd love to have those conversations.
Great. Well, Jared should be booked out for a long time because this is an important conversation that we're having. I think we all need to wrestle with it, walk through it, and say, where's this coming from? What do we need to do better? And yeah, what are the stories that we need to hear? And so it was a fantastic conversation. Really loved it. So thank you so much, Jared.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.